When Osama first proposed this idea a few weeks ago, I felt we should begin with a book that, reflecting our ambitions for this series, is broad in scope, ambitious in terms of what it wants to achieve, and in my opinion, having spent some time with it, is the kind of book that one comes across perhaps once every few years that speaks to everyone in the field of Islamic studies, and indeed beyond the field. I'm sure those working on other religious traditions and more generally would profit from reading the book. But it's a book that seeks to explain a great deal and develops a particular conceptual scheme, a tripartite scheme for doing so. And to begin, the book, which is called Lived Islam, Colloquial Religion in a Cosmopolitan Tradition, really seeks to account for the tremendous and even bewildering diversity one encounters in Islam as it is actually practiced in the world. And Reinhart appeals to the category of lived religion, which is to say increasingly popular among scholars of religious studies, anthropologists and others. Lived religion is the kind of religion you would encounter in everyday life in different contexts. It is the Islam, for our purposes, of those who do not professionally write about Islam, although indeed what theologians and others write is also of considerable interest, and Reinhart draws on it a great deal. Now, in what sense is, the book cover, it's a very colorful and brilliantly chosen image, which reflects this diversity in a very visible way. So it's a charming image. What the book seeks to account for is this bewildering diversity among Muslims, and the fact that notwithstanding this diversity, Muslims still see and recognize one another as Muslims, and scholars are still able to relate these variant, divergent practices to something that all Muslims have in common, or most Muslims have in common. So Reinhart develops a tripartite scheme for conceptualizing this diversity and reflecting its kind of layeredness. So the kind of key concept at the heart of this book, or the key typology or conceptual framework Reinhart develops, which I think is an incredibly fruitful one that other scholars can benefit from, is he draws on the language and the terminology of sociolinguistics. So how does one understand and conceptualize the varieties in language? And as a member of the faculty here at the University of Edinburgh, it's something I did think about a lot when I first came here. When you see conversations between members of the administrative staff who are normally locally recruited, some of them speaking quite thick Scotch accents, and the faculty, which is very international and very diverse. And it was always quite entertaining to see Americans struggling to understand Scottish colleagues. So that's something I've thought about myself. And how does he operationalize these kind of distinctions when thinking about Islam as a lived religion? Reinhart speaks about dialect, koine, and standard forms of Islam. These are forms of Islam that kind of feature prominently in different contexts, and always Reinhart has an eye towards regional particularism as distinct from, say, this high scholarly tradition. Now, I should probably just take a moment to explain exactly what these distinctions mean in a meaningful sense. Dialect Islam, if you think about dialects in terms of languages as well, is the Islam that is practiced in a particular context, in a particular time and place. We have many excellent scholarly accounts of dialect Islam, whether by anthropologists, missionaries, and even cosmopolitan scholarly critics of bid'ah and so on. And there's a big literature on this, of course. Dialect Islam is what one actually finds in a particular context that would not necessarily be recognized by other Muslims in other contexts, and may even seem abhorrent to them. And in the pre-modern world, one doesn't need to go far to find examples of dialect Islam. And to return to the simile of language, compare, for instance, standard English as spoken by presenters on BBC News to, for example, the dialect of English one finds in darkest Glasgow, as it were. Now, to a proponent of standard English, which is an English that really exists mostly in textbooks, and it's the kind of English one teaches foreigners. But it is a language that is not really one spoken or native tongue, as it were. It is a sort of construct. And it is beyond place and beyond any of these local particularistic features. Now, of course, this standard privileges a certain form of the language and marginalizes others, and Reinhart discusses now. So dialect is this local particularistic form of Islam. Koine, unlike dialect, is recognized by the majority of Muslims, the vast majority of the Muslims, and across time and space. It is the Islam that is kind of broadly shared by Muslims, but it is always and already locally inflected or contextually inflected. And Reinhart gives a number of examples of these. One great instance being the Hajj. Now, the Hajj is a norm, or at least the idea of the Hajj, shared broadly among Muslims. Of course, you can always find marginal groups of those who identify as Muslims but do not identify with any of these broadly shared ideas, and Reinhart recognizes that explicitly. But nonetheless, broadly shared but locally inflected. So what it actually means in a particular context to a particular set of persons is also something that's subject to variety. And here and in the book more generally, so many rich examples illustrating this great variety are given, often citing anthropological literature, which Reinhart is very much, has a great facility with. So, for instance, if you think of the Hajj, he gives the example of a Malaysian pilgrim for whom the Hajj is really about accumulating barakah, and it's only secondarily about performing these rites that you find discussed at great length in works of Islamic law, or furu'. But for instance, for Malcolm X, the Hajj was primarily about racial unity, and endless other iterations of this variety. So the dialect is the highly localized and particularistic that would not be recognized broadly across the one, may even be seen as abhorrent by others. Right. And the koine is shared and is nonetheless always already inflected in particular contexts. Now, again, returning to this simile of lived religion as language, koine being the lingua franca in much of the Near East, in the Hellenistic world. So again, it's not a language that you would have necessarily spoken at home. It's the language of the Gospels, but it is broadly shared by many groups. And finally, the third, from my perspective as an Islamicist who spends a great deal of time engaging with this particular form of Islam as a religion, there is standard or cosmopolitan Islam. And this, by contrast with the other forms, is the Islam of no particular place and no particular time. Like standard language, it kind of projects a universality and certain kinds of myth of universality are associated, not in a derogatory sense, of course, are associated with this particular form of Islam. And this is the Islam of the prestige Islam of the scholars. Right. It is a kind of body of ilm, and the purveyors of standard Islam are the masters of this textual tradition and its authorized kind of hermeneutical techniques and resulting interpretations.
In a sense, in the academy has been the main focus of study, and it's the sort of stuff that I would have studied in a seminary or Darul Ulum context.
Of course, and Reinhart is aware of the kind of pedagogical element here in the sense that when one teaches language, he says, one does not teach, unless you're going to learn the dialect specifically, one does not learn or teach rather, American or English or Scots English. It's you go to learn the standard language.
Right.
It is the form that is that one masters, and if you can demonstrate your aptitude and your learning in theory, you're put on an equal footing to others.